We're really excited to be talking to you. One of the reasons is that this work in human-centered design is incredibly relevant to us today in a way we would not have guessed. We wouldn't have looked at the impacts of our well-being in the same manner, I think, at least for me. So can you tell us how your interest came about this whole topic?
So we work in human-centered design. So we have a very strong focus on, very broadly, we're looking at the interaction between humans and their technology, which is one way of defining what industrial design is. And one of those things that's very important is understanding our environment, the environment that we live in. And that's, as you're sort of saying, in terms of our current conditions and having to live at home. It's interesting to note that I can't think it was about 10 years ago, the world population crossed a milestone where over half the population was living in cities. And that was an important thing in terms of that population, because it meant most of the population is now living inside an environment that has been designed for them, and they're not living in what we would call natural environments. And so it's very important that we understand and think about our relationship with our environment, because our environment is now being made. It's a made environment, and we really need to think very hard about that to make sure that we fit our environment properly. Sorry, our environment fits us properly. The way we got sort of involved in it is we were invited by DSTG to work on, which is the Defence Science Technology Group, to work with them to look at habitability on board submarines, because they were submarines, very small, very confined, and very, very challenging places to live in. And that identified that the current submarines have a number of problems, and they wanted to make them better. So they said, look, we actually understand a lot of the science, but we know that we need to reach out to design who work in that space, that difficult space between technology and humans. And they said, well, how do you work with humans? How do you understand what humans need? And then how do you then interpret that and then create designs that suit them more?
So living in this weird space, or from your expertise being in this strange space between the design and science and as a designer, what does your role specifically involve?
A lot of it's actually listening to people, because I think often what happens is people who are designing spaces for other people, you really have to understand what their experience is like and really understand what pressures they're feeling to make sure that if you're designing for them, it is actually right for them. And there's so many examples of people who are living in environments that really weren't designed properly or carefully, and then you're stuck with it, and then you're constantly having to deal with the fact that the storage is wrong, or that the door handle's in the wrong location. And if you don't listen carefully at the beginning, it's very easy for people to not deliberately make the design bad, but inadvertently, by making some very bad assumptions about the other people, they might do something the designer says, I think this seems like a good idea, or I think this suits me. But if there's a disconnect between what they think is right and then what the actual users are needing, the user's like, oh, this doesn't fit me. And so the first solution, which is the easiest thing, is just take the time to listen to the people that are actually using it to make sure that it fits them. And because submarines, the submarines are really a category of what we call isolated, confined environments. And they're the sorts of things where, say, if you're living in Antarctica, or particularly now that they're talking about space exploration, the moon or Mars, or submarines are examples of these environments, which are very isolated, very confined, very extreme. And so those environments in particular are very difficult to live in, because they're so small and they're so intense. And what it means is even little things can cause very big problems in those environments.
That's quite interesting, because I have had the feeling of, being stuck in a box, or feeling almost claustrophobic being stuck at home. But that's still quite different from what you were saying about this isolated and confined environment like a submarine or Antarctica. So in your work looking at designing for complex confined human environments, what correlations have you been seeing between your work and what we're going through now?
I mean, it's interesting you say that, because I remember reading in the paper what was going on in, the big city. We probably don't, in Adelaide, we've had a sort of a different experience of this, because most of us are living in semi-detached houses. Most of us don't have that aren't living in apartments. But when I was reading about the conditions that were going on in, Italy and London, where they've got very, very dense populations, and they're then confined to very small apartments. It became apparent to me that a great deal of the stuff that I'd been reading was very applicable. It really sounded very similar to what they were doing. So I'll give you an example. NASA's now doing an enormous amount of research, because they're having to think very seriously about what's going to happen when we start sending people to Moon for 3 or 4 months, maybe longer, but also then thinking very seriously about sending people to Mars. And so if they go to Mars, they're probably going to be living on Mars for 12 to 18 months. And so they're now thinking very, very hard about, if you've now got a group of people in a fairly small environment for a very long period of time, what happens? What's it going to be like? So I'll share a screen with you if I can for a second. I'll just show you a couple of images about some of these things. So what happens is, in order for NASA to understand what it's like to live in those living conditions, they create what they call analogues, which is where it's an experiment, essentially, where they create something that they think will be like a Mars habitat or a Moon habitat. And then people will then be shut up in that habitat for weeks or months at a time. So then they can observe how people behave under those extreme conditions and understand it better. And then they can use that understanding to create better environments. So I'm going to try and share my screen so I can show you a couple of images of what they are, so you can understand what's going on. So bear with me, and hopefully this works. So what you're looking at here is a Mars analog that's housed at NASA. And you can see the size of that. It's not very big, but they'll be taking, I think it's between 4 and 6 people will be living in that space for months at a time. So the experience that you were saying with this isolation from COVID, this isn't too dissimilar from what some people who are living in flats in places in Australia, but particularly overseas. And when I was looking at what was going on, I was like, well, we're all now living a Mars analog, because this is exactly what they do in these analog studies. They lock people up in small spaces and see how they go. So this is the interior of that analog. And so you do get this real sense, like you were saying, of this claustrophobia. It's a very small space. In some cases, people are living with family or flatmates or something like that. So you now have to share this very small space with a number of people for a prolonged period of time. And it is difficult. It is very, very challenging to live in those environments. And it's interesting when you look at what we're learning from those Mars analogues and how we apply them. There's a lot of interesting kind of things that come out of that do provide some interesting insights and perhaps provide a little bit of assurance or guidance about how people might be able to live in this situation now.
Yeah, for sure. And has there been any observations of people living in the kind of sudden isolation that we have had to in Adelaide and around the world versus people living in these kind of prepared and practiced isolation?
Not that I'm aware of. I think this is also new. I think we're only just starting to frame the questions. And I think the question you ask is very interesting, because I think as it is interesting. It's always sort of terrible to find some bright light in what's a very challenging thing. But because I think we're going to be learning an enormous amount about how people understand and think about their home environments and how they live in their homes, because we've all been forced into this experiment. And I think people are now, well, I think we're fortunate. We're sort of coming out the back end of this okay, but there are still people in lots of areas who are still very much in lockdown. But I think once they start to be able to shake that off, I think people's thinking and understanding about how they create their domestic environments is going to change a bit. I mean, I can give you sort of a few kind of examples of things that kind of happen. So, a real challenge that some people have is territoriality and privacy. And depending on the size of your home, that can be very, very difficult to negotiate. And you do see that in places like submarines and some of the stuff that comes out of NASA. When you get a group of people together for a long time, it's interesting when you look at how people behave. People actually, even social people who want to be around people, when you actually look at how they spend their time, they're probably spending about 75% of their time on their own. And that's a social person. We actually spend a lot more time in our own company than we probably think we do. And we don't realize how much we do that until you're pushed into the big brother situation, or, the situation where you're confined with a group of people and you can't just walk out the door or go for a walk, or you're not going to work regularly. And then you start discovering that other people are annoying the hell out of you. Because we actually need this sort of, there's always this weird, interesting tension between people. We crave social connection, but it's also actually very important and very necessary for us to have time on our own for reflection, to take out some of those social pressures and so on. So people who are living, confined at home with flatmates and so on, if they're feeling a bit overwhelmed by it, they are well within their rights to kind of say to their flatmates, don't take it personally. I like you, but I just need to be alone now for a while. And that's not, people might feel guilty about that, or they might think, oh, hang on, what's wrong? I like this person. Why am I feeling so agitated? Well, that's actually a very normal human thing. People do like to be around other people, but it is actually very necessary for us, for our own psychological benefit, for our own nourishment, for our own ability to kind of help make sense of things, to isolate ourselves for a while, to just sit in your room for a bit. And so we see this in submarines, where that's an incredibly social environment where people are constantly together, like you saw in the picture I just shared. The only private space, there's only 3 private spaces they have. Their sleeping berth, when they go to the toilet, and when they have a shower. The rest of the time, there's always someone around. And, a really important message we hear from them is they love their sleeping berth, because they climb in that space, they shut the curtain, and then the psychological relief, which is, I'm on my own, I can now find my own time. And that's really important. So, that's interesting, because I think some people who haven't been in that situation struggle with the idea that I need to be on my own. And it's like, no, that's normal. That's actually natural. And it's actually, you're completely within your rights to ask for that. And everyone's going to benefit if everyone has permission to give each other that space and that kind of stuff. Another thing that's also kind of interesting that comes out of it is some people who are trying to find the bright side in the whole COVID isolation experience said, I can learn another language, or, if I'm doing so, I'll study this, or I'll read all the great books and novels of the world, now that I've got this opportunity to do it. And I think after 4 months, everyone's gone, well, how did it go? Well, I've really caught up on my Netflix binging, and I've watched every episode of Brooklyn Nine-Nine 5 times. And there's this sort of bit of, I'm not a very worthy person. I've had this opportunity, and, I've kind of fluffed it a bit. Everyone else seems to be, learning new moves for TikTok or something like that. Everyone's doing stuff. But actually, again, when you look at the research about how people behave in these environments, it's actually very common. You particularly see it on people that are wintering over in Antarctica. They'll go, look, I'm wintering over. I can't get outside very much at all. I've got all this. I'm going to spend this time building a hobby. I'm going to learn to play piano or something like that. And again, it's a very common thing that over time people then find it harder. There's nothing wrong with passive leisure. I think people feel very guilty about passive leisure. They feel like, no, I should be doing worthy leisure. I should be doing something of virtue. But the reality is, most people, if they're working and they're doing stuff, when they hit their leisure time, most people most of the time will turn on the telly and do that sort of stuff. Now, this isn't to sort of give license to binge away, but I think it does give people some sort of, look, if you sort of thought, I can use this opportunity really well, and you feel kind of guilty for, I've really stuffed this up. Look, this is very natural behaviour. When we look at people in submarines, when we look at people in Antarctica, it's normal. People, there's nothing wrong with having passive leisure time. And in fact, in some cases, it's probably just the right thing. If that's how you're going, pack away the guilt. As long as you're keeping active in other areas, that's fine. So if people are feeling a bit guilty about the fact that it seems that everyone else has learned something new and I haven't, actually, you're probably more normal. Actually, people over time will probably do that kind of stuff. So give yourself a break. That's just how people roll. So don't feel bad about that.
Well, they're both great things to hear, and if people aren't confident enough to tell their flatmate or the people they're living with that they just need some space, and that's perfectly fine. You could clip this interview and play, leave it on their email or something for them to watch back, and as a little hint. And yeah, good to know and be able to drop that guilt about not all becoming experts in 17 new things over this period. I do wonder what it would be like to live on Mars in such a small space with someone who didn't do the dishes or something. That would be annoying. So I guess there are some traits that lend themselves to living like this, and then some traits that lend themselves not to living like this. Are there any other challenges in creating design for these situations, as well as I guess creating design for kind of other areas that you've created design for in the past?
Yeah, look, it's interesting. I mean, and you sort of touched on the thing about your flatmate not doing the dishes. And you're right. There's an interest. There's actually a lot of psychology that we've been reading around. It's not my main area, but it is a big deal about how you choose people. It's a very interesting area. But it does pick up on a really important thing, which is another thing that you do tend to notice is people will start to get incredibly frustrated and angry by things that previously didn't really bother them at all. And again, this is a very common kind of thing where if you're living in the same environment for prolonged periods of time, there's a monotony to it. And that monotony can actually be kind of fairly exhausting. And sometimes that can express itself, and people sometimes can be a bit bemused by the fact that things that, maybe your flatmate doesn't do their dishes enough, and 9 times out of 10, you're like, that's fine, take some rubbish out or something, it's okay, it all balances out. But what you do find is when people are in these isolated environments with other people for prolonged periods, trivial things which under normal circumstances wouldn't trigger them can just push them over the edge, and it can just push them right over. And sometimes I think people get a bit mystified where a cupboard door doesn't quite open, and if they've been isolated for a few weeks, they just go into an absolute fit of rage because this tiny thing just is not working. And then they kind of go, I'm a calm guy, I'm reasonable. What's happened? Why am I suddenly so angry here? And again, this is not uncommon that under those extreme environments, trivial things can take on frustration and will create an emotional response to people way out of proportion from what you think it is. And you say, why am I so angry with this can opener? This doesn't make sense. And so, I think if anyone's been in this situation where they're sort of taken aback by their own fury at things, again, when we look at the research about things that frustrate people, it's interesting how small things can just blow up out of proportion. So that then does actually mean that, from our point of view, from the challenge of creating environments for that kind of challenge, we have to be very sensitive to what people are doing and how they live their lives under those conditions. Because if you get one little thing wrong, we might design it and look at it and think, is that door handle in the right place? Or does this door swing open in the right way, kind of thing? And when we're standing here going home at night having a normal life, we think, that's fine. But we've got to be aware that if that's a bit wrong, the person who's opening that door up and they're looking at that door 3 or 4 times a day, and they're opening that door 3 or 4 times a day, and they're doing that for months, that little frustration can just get out of control. So we've got to be ultra sensitive to these very, very small things. Now, you can't eliminate all of them, but we've got to be much more mindful of these small things than we probably would be in a normal environment where people have lots of opportunities to go to another environment or to experience something different. It's that intensity of use. I mean, as people, we kind of crave and need that variation, you know. And so when we lose that opportunity to get that those little things just keep eating at you. And so, and it's actually why designing for these very isolated, confined environments is actually so interesting, because every little design decision matters out of proportion than anything else you would normally do. And so as a designer working in this space, we have got to be accountable for so much more, and we can't take anything for granted. We've got to be much more careful and mindful of what we're doing. And we're actually really enjoying that challenge, because we think that if you really want to understand how people behave in an environment, if you really want to think about how we design environments for people, so like I said at the beginning, you know, half the population now lives in cities. So, you know, so many people are now living in small apartments and so on. So if we really want to think about this problem about how do we create environments, a really interesting way to unpack that problem is go to the most extreme environment that you can imagine and put people into the most challenging situation that you can. And then say, how does that work for them? And what do we need to think about there? So if you can go to that real extreme, you can learn things about people and their environments that you might miss in a normal kind of environment. So I think we really want to go to kind of those extreme edge cases. So, you know, something like there's a study done in 1968, fascinating study by NASA. This is an interesting study. This is before they landed a man on the moon, and they had this report saying, when we design the moon base, what will it look like? I mean, they're incredibly forward thinking. And they said, when we design the moon base, what's the best thing on Earth we can compare it to? And they said it was submarines. And so two of the most extreme living conditions we can imagine are living on a submarine, a military submarine, or living on the moon or Mars. So I have the opportunity to look at living in submarines, and it's a fascinating thing. And the reason it's fascinating is it is the most extreme living environment that we willingly put ourselves into. And so if we can understand that and get that right, and we can really think hard about that kind of stuff, hopefully we can sort of discover some ideas or really be able to point at stuff and then come back and sort of say, look, we should think about these things differently, or, you know, this is how we can approach these kinds of problems. And then other people that are designing other environments that maybe aren't as chronic or maybe as severe, we can learn from that. We can sort of say, okay, these big cities, more people now have to live in micro apartments. This is becoming a new norm now in a lot of areas. Recently in China, because their cities are becoming so extreme, they're talking about extremely small apartments now as being viable, particularly for young single people and that sort of stuff. But things that we probably know not much bigger than what we would consider to be a normal domestic bathroom. So we can see on our cities some of these problems coming about. So let's go to the most extreme environments, learn, and then let's bring that back and say, can we apply this now for this other reality that's going on in our worlds?
Yeah, for sure. And we've just got a couple of questions through from some viewers, and you've talked around these issues, so feel free to give some quick answers if you like. One person asks, to what degree are different needs or personalities taken into account with the design? And how do you design to balance personal need for isolation and efficient use of space?
The personality thing is very interesting, and to a certain extent, these extreme environments, there's actually a lot of thinking about selection. There's a lot of interesting things about self-selection. So the difficulty we have with the COVID thing is we've all been forced into it. We had no choice, okay? But typically when you're talking about space and submarines, there's a fair bit of vetting and that kind of stuff. So I think people are now discovering a lot about their housemates or partners they might not have discovered before. Now we're getting to the area of psychology. I work with psychology people around that, so I'm delving a little bit out of my area. So I'm aware of that kind of stuff. I know that there's a lot of care that's done into the selection process. And actually, some of the things I study, a lot of it also comes down to leadership, but there's also a lot of interesting stuff when they look at some of the extreme things in the Antarctic exploration, like with Shackleton and so on. Some really interesting case studies around them about how their personalities worked, so that them as a group, they could overcome those hardships and then survive. The other question, which was around using space and using it efficiently, that's such a large part of the time we do. There's a whole area that we do which is done on anthropometry, which is understanding human body sizing. So we spend a lot of time working with people to understand the differences in the body sizes between the smallest and tallest people in the population, basically. And then how do we make sure that the environment, it's a really challenging thing, because you need to make the environment comfortable for the biggest person in your population. And that can create some really challenging constraints for what you do. And a lot of it really just comes down to, if you really understand what people are doing and why they're doing and how they're doing it, you can make sure that the space is efficiently set up for that particular thing. And like I said, listen to people, understand what they need, and then use the space as efficiently as possible. And that just comes through a long iterative process.
It sounds like you've given us quite a lot to think about, and especially just small things like asking for our own space. And I definitely know that I have a really annoying door handle in one of my doors. So just trying to think about how I put furniture in my own house as well. So thank you so much, Peter. That has been really fascinating. We've really appreciated you coming onto Mod TV this afternoon.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you very, very much.